I'm using a PowerPoint in the first 15 minutes part one of the lecture. So I will now start to share my screen, and then Christophe will speak in a different mode, presenting his part of the lecture. Can I get confirmation that you see my introductory slide?
Yes, we do. Please go ahead.
We will address citizenship stripping as a counter-terrorism measure, which is one framework where we have the human rights versus security issue. There have been many other discourses where the same dilemma is faced by democratic countries and human rights oversight bodies. Now in the context of citizenship stripping, which prevails, human rights or security, or are they compatible with each other, is the theme. I start by presenting the human rights dimension. Is there a right to citizenship? Is that a human right? If one looks at the origins of the normative framework of human rights, 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, yes, everyone has a right to a nationality and shall not be arbitrarily denied of it. It's a very skillful formulation, paragraphs 1 and 2 of Article 15, where paragraph 1 has the right, everyone has a right to a nationality. But please note, it says a nationality. It doesn't say of which country, it doesn't say who is the addressee of this part of the norm. But then the second part, shall not be arbitrarily deprived of it, addresses itself to any state which is the country of citizenship for a person. So once the right in paragraph 1 has been realized, then there is also an obliged state which must not arbitrarily deny an existing citizenship. We know that at the background is the long historical tradition of jus soli or jus sanguinis. Does citizenship flow from being born in a country? Or does it flow from the bloodline, from your parents previously, predominantly the father, nowadays equally from either one of the parents? So that is the background for the ambiguous wording in Article 15 of the Universal Declaration. Then we have a little bit later, from 1954 and 1961, two international treaties, conventions concerning statelessness. The first one is about status of stateless persons. The second one is about reduction of statelessness, including quite specific legal norms, trying to attribute to a specific state the right to grant a nationality. However, human rights treaties have largely failed to live up to the challenge of the Universal Declaration, in the sense that neither the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, nor the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has a provision that gives effect to Universal Declaration right to a nationality, right to a citizenship. Except that in the ICCPR, there's a clause about children. Article 24 of the ICCPR is kind of a mini Child of the Rights Convention, where one of the provisions says every child has a right to acquire a nationality. That matter, subject matter, is then in detail regulated in the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, which inter alia pronounces clearly that if a state is born in a country, jus soli will apply should the child otherwise become stateless. So a state has an obligation to grant its own citizenship, where the child doesn't get a citizenship of another country. That's one way to reduce statelessness, which has been transformed into a treaty norm also in the ICCPR. What follows now is three quite modest elements of a human right. First one is that right of a child. If the child otherwise is stateless, jus soli must be followed. Secondly, arbitrary citizenship stripping is prohibited. And on the basis of the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, one can clearly say that there is a presumption that if deprivation of citizenship is arbitrary, if the consequence is that person will become stateless, then this is one factor why the stripping is determined as arbitrary. So we can say there is a prohibition of stripping citizenship if a person as a consequence becomes stateless. That would be the rule and a presumption. And finally, the general norm of no discrimination shall apply, which means that, for instance, geographic, religion-based or so-called race-based distinctions as to who can become citizens or whose citizenship can be stripped are prohibited. Secondly, one important development since these treaties has been the gradual move to broader acceptance of dual or even multiple citizenship. There was an earlier prevailing view according to which citizenship means a strong bond of loyalty between the individual and the state, and there can be only one country of citizenship. If you become, through your consent, including by taking up a post in another country, in the service of another country, a citizen of a country, you would lose, you would be stripped by the force of law of your citizenship. And that law still applies. It results inter alia to situations where it's not so easy to determine whether a person is a citizen or not, because a country may have a law which means automatic ipso jure stripping of citizenship if you get the citizenship in another country, but nobody keeps a record who have become stripped of their citizenship therefore. Well, the flow is towards liberalizing the regime of citizenship so that countries nowadays widely accept, typically Western countries at least, multiple or at least dual citizenship, including because of gender equality, that you recognize citizenship equally on the basis of the father's citizenship or the mother's citizenship. The consequence has been wide acceptance of dual citizenship. Paradoxically, this may widen the permissible scope for citizenship stripping, in the sense that one country can strip a person of his or her citizenship without the person becoming stateless. There would still remain the other one. Further, we have the relatively new concept of EU citizenship, which reflects the trend of accepting dual multiple citizenship, where EU nationals of one EU member state have many rights typically belonging to citizens only in respect of other EU countries, and perhaps the most far-reaching, at least in legal sense, is the right to diplomatic protection. That EU embassies in other parts of the world give diplomatic protection to EU citizens of another country. So that's a clearly state type of function that evolves through EU citizenship to be related to multiple states. And one can say that if now EU member states are applying citizenship stripping, including in the context of counterterrorism, it will result in complex issues of EU law, because it affects also other EU member states. One loses with the national citizenship, also EU citizenship, and hence rights in relation to other EU member states, including the right to diplomatic protection in totally other parts of the world. The person may have lived most of his life in another EU country, then part of his life in a third country. And now suddenly a decision by the country of birth to strip him of nationality means he is protected neither by his main country of residence, another EU country, or the diplomatic protection that he would get in a different part of the world. This may narrow down the scope of permissible citizenship stripping, because what perhaps otherwise wouldn't be arbitrary may become arbitrary because of this kind of consequences. And finally, all this results in a situation that a state cannot know. It cannot know and it cannot determine whether a person is a citizen of another country. So if it strips its own nationality, it can't be sure that the person doesn't become stateless. Simply no record is kept, and the courts of my country A are not competent to determine whether I'm also a citizen of country B. There are many cases that raise this dilemma, where national courts try to master other countries' law. Third point is that in many human rights national security is a legitimate aim that justifies limitations upon human rights. So human rights are promises, they give rise to human rights claims, but they are not on their own all things considered rights. You also must look at the other side of the coin, permissible limitations. Neither Article 24, the child rights provision, or Article 26, the non-discrimination clause in the ICCPR, has a limitation clause referring to national security. Nevertheless, national security is broadly accepted as a generally applicable legitimate aim for restrictions, and that would, for instance, govern whether treatment that is allegedly discriminatory has reasonable and objective justification. If it's done in the name of national security, it may have reasonable and objective justification. Hence, we must look into national security in the context of stripping citizenship and determining whether the rule of prohibiting arbitrary deprivation of citizenship applies and makes a country's move illegitimate. Nevertheless, I want to say that even if national security is a legitimate aim, it's not enough to have a legitimate aim. There are many other conditions that must be met. The law concerning citizenship stripping must meet the quality of the law test. It must be foreseeable, usually in the form of a written statute, acceptable, allowing the individual in advance to determine what will be the consequences of his or her action. Second, it doesn't suffice that you invoke a legitimate aim. You must show that there is a benefit towards meeting that legitimate aim. Merely symbolic laws based on national security are not permissible under human rights if they don't deliver national security. It's permitted to deliver national security through measures that restrict human rights, but not through measures that do nothing to contribute towards national security. So ineffective, useless, counterproductive laws cannot be justified with reference to national security. This is related to the fact that in order to be compatible with the human rights, a measure that intrudes with human rights must be proven to be the least intrusive, equally effective measure. If the same effective service towards a legitimate aim can be otherwise reached, you can't use the method that results in intrusion into human rights. And finally, we have the proportionality test. Once you have proven the benefit towards national security and you have demonstrated what's the degree of human rights intrusion, you can legitimately compare. You can weigh them against each other in an effort to reconcile them. I'm an opponent of the general balancing metaphor. If you say national security and individual human rights must be balanced, it usually means national security always wins. Invoking national security always wins. But if you say, prove me the benefit towards national security through stripping this person of his nationality, then we speak, then we are in business. We can address the question, is it proportionate to strip person A of his or her nationality? I also mentioned the condition a measure can be human rights compatible only if it's not in breach of other obligations under international law. And there are two issues here. One is a reference back to the prohibition of arbitrary citizenship stripping, but the other one is what Christophe will speak to, namely the question whether citizenship stripping actually is against international law in another sense. If you invoke national security to justify citizenship stripping and say that it's a proportionate measure, that the benefit towards national security is so great that it justifies the human rights intrusion, then you, by your own justification, commit yourself to assess what's beneficial to national security. And here we have an important issue, which is that it may very well be that citizenship stripping is counterproductive for national security. And this is because the rule aut dedere, aut judicare, extradite or prosecute, is so central in international criminal law that it is one way to assess what is best serving national security of my country and countries in general. It's very common in international instruments, conventions, protocols, resolutions against terrorism, that they include this requirement. A country must either extradite or prosecute persons who have committed any of the terrorist offenses. And the paradox is that in many cases, the country where the person has lived may be the only effective tie, only effective jurisdictional tie to successful prosecution. If a person is stateless, there may be no other country that has jurisdiction than the one where the person has lived and has had the citizenship, which is now stripped. Also, there may be another country where the person has nationality, but is unwilling, perhaps because of being a failed state or controlled by forces that are aligned with the terrorist organization movement where the person has been involved. So by stripping your citizenship from a person, you as a state, may result in a situation of impunity. There is no country in the world other than yours that would be qualified to prosecute the person, and your right to prosecute is based on the fact that the person is your citizen. If you strip of citizenship, the result may be that the person goes not unpunished and not prosecuted. So this is where I will give the floor to Christophe, simply by saying that the citizenship stripping issue is nowadays raised in the foreign terrorist fighter framework. Returning foreign terrorist fighters who come back to their EU countries or other countries, and countries are trying to prevent it, including by stripping of their citizenship. This, to me, appears to be in direct contradiction with the Mandatory Security Council resolution, the cornerstone of measures against foreign terrorist fighters, resolution 2178, which has an explicit clause on extradite or prosecute. And you may lose your right to prosecute if you strip a person of his or her citizenship. I stop here. I'll be available for questions later, but now I hand over to Christophe, who presents the second part of this one single lecture. Thank you.
And I would like to second, first of all, indeed, Martin's point that this should be seen as one lecture in two parts. And I think this webinar comes at a crucial time, as deprivation of nationality or citizenship stripping, I will use the terms interchangeably, is increasingly in use around the world as a counterterrorism measure. And it also goes for the Netherlands, my country of origin, on which I would like to focus this afternoon. Now, in fact, at the moment, there is a bill on the table that seeks to make permanent the now temporary power until the 1st of March 2022 of the Dutch Minister of Justice and Security to revoke nationality in the interest of national security. Now, does the measure of deprivation of nationality make us safer? Is it an efficient counterterrorism measure? In the following minutes, I will argue, one, that this measure represents a limited vision of the concept of national security. Two, that the idea to take a broader view of the concept of national security is not just my own opinion, but is shared by many other actors working in this field. Three, that revoking nationality is undermining the public prosecution service to prosecute serious crimes, and thus the fight against impunity, which was already mentioned. And four, that this measure is discriminatory, which has obvious human rights implications, but also security ramifications. Now, first of all, the limited view on the notion of national security. The law in the Netherlands regulating the measure enables the Minister of Justice and Security to revoke, in the interest of national security, the nationality of a person who has reached the age of 16 and who is outside of the Netherlands, if from his or her conduct it follows that he or she has joined an organization that the Minister has placed on a list of organizations participating in a non-international or international armed conflict and posing a threat to national security. Now, the idea behind this measure is that if the nationality of someone abroad is being revoked, this person can also no longer return to the Netherlands. And in this way, we keep the potential risk this person poses temporarily outside of our territory, and this will be beneficial to our national security. Now, this may sound logical, but it represents, of course, a very limited view of the concept national security, one that is arguably no longer in sync with the hyper-connected world in which we live and in which alleged terrorists, who really do not care about borders, operate. It is dangerous to think that if we keep the problem temporarily outside of our territory, we are safe. Looking away from the problem does not mask that the problem is still there, and that there is no guarantee whatsoever that something will be done about it. And this, of course, can have very serious consequences, and not just for the security of the inhabitants of the countries in the region where we dump the products of our own society. And we should not forget that we're talking here about our own compatriots who radicalize here in the Netherlands, but also for the security of the inhabitants of the Netherlands in the long run. At this moment, especially Western governments, through their refusal to take responsibility for their own citizens, are right on track to transform the camps in northern Syria into a camp Buka 2.0, named after the infamous American camp in Iraq after the invasion in 2003. Now, in that camp, all prisoners were locked up together and not really looked after, the consequence being further radicalization, the creation of new terrorist networks, and the birth of ISIS. We see now in Syria similar developments, and people are even escaping from the camps, are being smuggled out of the camps, or are simply released from the camps, because the Kurds have other things to worry about. And so many individuals disappear off the radar. Now, these people, if they really pose a threat, can join terrorist groups and in that way create serious security problems, again, in the region itself, but they can also, through the fact they are no longer traceable to the security services, get back unseen and create havoc here. And the attacks in Paris in November 2015 are a good illustration of the seriousness of not having a view on or control over dangerous individuals. Support for this vision. And this latter view, which takes a broader view of the notion of national security, both from a territorial and temporal perspective, is supported by many other experts and international organizations, such as the Council of Europe. And not just some experts, I'm talking here about seasoned national security experts, such as Richard Barrett, the former director of global counterterrorism at MI6, and Brett McGurk, the former special presidential envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS. In an open letter to Western governments of September 2019, entitled "Unless We Act Now, the Islamic State Will Rise Again," Barrett and McGurk, together with several other national security experts, wrote, and I quote, "Western governments, for the most part, have refused to take their nationals back. Some have revoked their citizenship. Others have called for an international tribunal based in Iraq, which amounts to another means of avoiding the tough but necessary responsibility of dealing with their own citizens. The trepidation is understandable, and by blocking the return of people they regard as dangerous, these states believe that they are protecting their citizens at home. In reality, however, this hands-off stance will only create greater danger in the future. And the denial of citizenship by their home nations will bolster their sense of being, in effect, citizens of the Islamic State, potentially preparing them to form the core of a future resurgence." End quote. In his review of research on the history of states' responses to foreign fighters and how these actions panned out, Dr. David Mallet has pointed out that, and I quote again, "Arab states preventing jihadis from returning from Afghanistan in the 1990s led to waves of foreign fighters spreading to war zones and failed states around the world. Osama bin Laden is exhibit A of the folly of stripping a foreign fighter citizenship and then washing your hands and assuming the individual is no longer your problem." 3. Undermining prosecution of serious crimes. Another problem of citizenship stripping is that this measure removes an important jurisdictional link of the public prosecution service to prosecute, namely the active nationality principle, on the basis of which crimes committed by one's own nationals abroad can be prosecuted. And as we know, many of these foreign fighters may have committed serious crimes, and terrorist crimes, but also international crimes such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Netherlands has always, and that should be applauded, supported the development of the international legal order. And the Netherlands has also often, and again rightly so, indicated that it wants to support the victims of the crimes of ISIS, such as the Yazidis, through the pursuit of accountability. However, taking away a suspect's nationality makes it much more difficult for the Public Prosecution Service to prosecute for both terrorist and international crimes. And this was also the conclusion of an evaluation of the Dutch law published last year. But it's not only the Public Prosecution Service that has problems with this measure. In the Dutch quality newspaper NRC of the 7th of January 2018, it was already noted that the entire Counter Terrorism chain, from municipalities to police and judiciary, have all internally turned against this measure. 4. The measure is discriminatory. Yet another problem of deprivation of nationality is that it can only be applied to people with more than one nationality, as revoking the nationality of so-called mono-citizens will lead to statelessness, which is to be avoided according to international law. Now, the problem is that this creates two classes of citizens in society. One for citizens with a single nationality, who can be dealt with in a less far-going administrative measure, for example, through a temporary area ban, and one for citizens with more than one nationality, to whom this far-going measure, impacting the right to have rights, can be imposed. In the Netherlands, and this may also be the case in many other Western countries, this means that minority groups are being disproportionately targeted by the measure. And this is because Dutch citizens with a Moroccan or Turkish background represent almost half of all Dutch people with a double nationality, even though each group as such only represents not more than 2.5% of the entire Dutch population. Now, we should not underestimate the fact that these groups are being disproportionately targeted, and not because they pose a more serious threat, but only because they have more than one nationality. And this is applying double standards. And applying double standards, discrimination can constitute elements playing a role in people radicalizing in the first place. Indeed, this is the infamous terrorist trap, which authorities obviously should avoid. Conclusion. Now, because of all these reasons and others, deprivation of nationality should not be resorted to, according to my view. There is no proof whatsoever that this measure makes us safer. To the contrary, there's broad consensus in the expert community that it increases insecurity as well as impunity for serious crimes. Now, in view of all these negative and counterproductive features, one wonders why such a measure is then still be resorted to. But unfortunately, in the field of countering terrorism, emotion often trumps common sense. Politicians, pressured by many of their constituents who demand a strong response to terrorist threats, are opting for as many measures as possible in the hope that some are successful, or at least in the hope that the voters see that something is being done in relation to the problem. Highly symbolic measures such as deprivation of nationality are in that sense, of course, outstanding ways to show muscle and to communicate that certain behavior will not be tolerated, even if that message can also be communicated through criminal prosecution or less far-going administrative measures. And to some extent, it's perhaps understandable why politicians have behaved in this way. They will do anything, even adopt inefficient and counterproductive measures, in order to avoid blame afterwards by their constituents that they did not do everything in their power to avoid a terrorist attack. Indeed, they are under enormous pressure to do the impossible. However, it is the task of politicians as well to explain to their voters that 100% security is simply unobtainable. Indeed, we should not criticize our politicians for the mere fact that an attack occurs. That, regrettably, has become part of our lives. However, we can and should criticize our politicians if they do not approach this problem calmly and wisely, as we expect from true leaders, so clearly assessing the effectiveness of certain measures before they are adopted, and thereby considering the international and long-term perspective, as well as all the norms and values that we stand for. And to that, we are entitled. I would like to conclude this presentation with a quote that I use a lot when teaching both students and counterterrorism professionals. And I think it's a very eloquent expression of the idea that terrorism is a widespread phenomenon that we should take very seriously, but that at the same time should not lead to responses that are even more serious for democratic societies in the long run. And these words come from Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And he noted in March 2015, "There's real danger that in their reaction to extremist violence, opinion leaders and decision makers will lose their grasp of the deeper principles that underpin the system for global security, which states built 70 years ago to ward off the horror of war. Terrorist attacks cannot destroy the values on which our societies are grounded, but laws and policies can. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.